United States versus the case of United States versus Kara Bassett. My name is Judge Schreier. And scoring judges, please look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and make sure that your audio and video are off. These should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. I'm going to ask for appearances now. Government?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Stephen Becker. I'm joined in court by my colleague, Mr. Bennett Dembski, who's going to be handling the technology side of things.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
We just have a few preliminary matters to attend to, Your Honor. Would you like to hear appearances from Mr. Besman or those first?
Yes, I'd like to hear from Mr. Besman, and then we'll come back to you for preliminary matters.
Yes, Your Honor.
Good morning, Your Honor. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, good morning.
My name is Matt Besman, and I'm joined with my co-counsel, Mr. Clay Owens, who's off camera handling the technology. And together we represent Ms. Kara Bassett.
Good morning. Mr. Becker, your preliminary matters, please.
Two things, Your Honor. First, we'd like to invoke Rule 615 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, constructively sequestering all witnesses, barring party representatives.
Granted.
We'd like to designate Detective Johnson as the state's party representative.
Mr. Besman.
No objections to that, Your Honor.
So designated.
Next, Your Honor, we would just like to note for the court that several documents have been pre-admitted into evidence, specifically Exhibits 4 through 33. And we're just going to be showing those on screen because they've already been admitted, if that's all right with Your Honor.
That's what I understand, but thank you for the reminder.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the prosecution is ready to proceed.
Mr. Besman, any preliminary matters from you, sir?
Yes, Your Honor. Given the format of these online competitions, I would just ask permission to remain seating as I'm addressing the court, even though I would usually be standing, of course, to show deference. Is that all right with the court? That's
fine because of the unusual nature of these proceedings. And that applies for both parties.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. And with that, the defense is ready for openings.
Great. Then we're going to now hear opening statements. Party, everyone should make sure they are in speaker view. And the button is in the upper right corner of the screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. And Mr. Becker, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, Mr. Besman, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant left pieces behind. It's August 25th, 2017, a sweltering summer day in Tallahassee, Florida. The police receive a call from a woman named Kara Bassett. She tells them that her husband is missing. His clothes, his valuables, his car, it's all still there. But she hasn't seen her husband in about a week. She tells the police that she doesn't know where he went, why he left, or how he disappeared. But as the police begin to search the scene, that's when things start to get a little unusual. You see, Ms. Bassett and her husband live on and own an animal sanctuary, specifically for elephants. And what the police find when they arrive at the scene is that a vial of tranquilizer for elephants is missing. A few hours later, they track the GPS records from Mr. Clark's car, her husband. And they find that her husband's car had been driven 100 miles east to a swamp on the night he disappeared, before being driven 100 miles back that same night. They find mud from that swamp, not only on the tires from that car, but on the defendant, his wife's boots. And then the real kicker. They find Mr. Clark's phone records. They find the defendant's phone records. And how many times has the defendant tried to call her husband since she claims he disappeared 7 days ago? 0. Not a call, not a text, nothing. Members of the jury, Don Clark did not just disappear. He was murdered by his wife, the defendant, Cara Bassett. And today we know because of those pieces that the defendant left behind. You're going to see those pieces today, members of the jury. And they'll tell you exactly what happened on August 18th, 2017. They'll show you how the defendant took that elephant tranquilizer, lethal to humans, and used it to kill her husband. The evidence will show that she took her husband's body to a swamp, dumped it, and then parked his car at an airport. Those pieces the defendant left behind are why we've charged her with murder in the first degree. To prove first-degree murder is pretty simple. We just have to show you two elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that she's the one who killed her husband. And second, that she did so with what's called malice aforethought, that she intended for her husband to die. Now, we have to show that beyond a reasonable doubt, and make no mistake, members of the jury, we will. We'll do it by asking you to follow those three pieces of evidence that the defendant left behind: the mud on her boots, the tranquilizer dart, and the phone records. Now, to prove that case, we're going to call FBI agent Johnson to the stand, the lead investigator in this case. And what she's going to tell you before she walks through that evidence is about what motive the defendant had to kill her husband. You'll learn that in the weeks leading up to Mr. Clark's disappearance, the two of them got into increasingly violent arguments about the nature of their animal sanctuary. You'll learn that the only way for the defendant to get her way would be if her husband was dead. And then Agent Johnson's going to walk you through those three pieces the defendant left behind. How she found that there was a missing syringe. How she found the defendant's boots covered in mud from that swamp, and how she found the phone records that show that she never tried to contact her husband. The members of the jury, as you listen to the evidence today, I want you to pay special attention to the discrepancies between what the defendant told the police and what the evidence she left behind can tell us. Because at the end of today's trial, I'm going to come up here again, and I'm going to ask you to trust the evidence. I'm going to ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Mr. Besman?
Yes, Your Honor.
May it please the court. Look a little closer. It's the morning of August 19th, 2017, and Cara Bassett wakes up to see her husband isn't home. She has a text message from him that says going out for a while, so she doesn't worry. At least not right away. But then a day passes, and then some more pass, and soon she's frantic. She calls the FBI and she says, "I don't know where my husband is. I'm worried he's missing. Can you help me?" She cooperates with them fully. She gives a statement. She tells them everything she knows. They don't find her husband. They put her in handcuffs. The government charges Cara Bassett with her own husband's murder. But when you look a little closer at the story they're about to present, you'll see that they have to ignore key pieces of evidence to make it all make sense. Evidence which will point to other people who could have committed this crime. For example, the evidence is going to show that Cara Bassett, she wasn't Don Clark's first wife. That was a woman named Lisa Clark, and Lisa Clark had a strong vengeance against the victim. She threatened him. She wanted him dead, and unlike Miss Bassett, when the FBI called her, she said, "I will not cooperate. I won't give you an alibi." But you'll learn that the government never considered Lisa Clark to be a suspect. Even more, we're going to call to the stand a documentarian named Joe Kwong. Miss Kwong was with Mr. Clark the day he disappeared. And she'll tell you that he received a mysterious text message that made him go pale with fear just hours before he was never seen again. Now, the government, they aren't going to be able to tell you who sent that text message, and that matters. Lisa Clark matters. The unknown person who sent the message matters, but you'll notice when Mr. Becker was giving his opening statement, he didn't mention either of them. That matters too. It matters because the government has the burden of proof in today's case. It's their job to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that it's only Kara Bassett who could be responsible for Mr. Clark's disappearance. Beyond a reasonable doubt, members of the jury, that is the highest burden in our legal system, and they carry it alone. As the defense, we don't have a burden of proof. We don't have to prove that our theory is true. They have to prove that it isn't. And they aren't going to be able to do that. Because when you look a little closer, you'll see that in order to manipulate a story that only includes two people, Kara Bassett and Don Clark, they're going to have to overlook people that you'll get to hear about. At the end of today's trial, you aren't going to have proof because the government isn't going to give it to you. And that's why I'm going to come back up before you and ask you to find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Besman. Okay. The government is going to call its first witness, but beforehand, everyone needs to shift to gallery view. And that's in the upper right corner of the screen. And once that's done, the government may call its first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Prosecution calls Detective Steph Johnson to the stand.
Detective Johnson, consider yourself sworn and you may be seated.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Sure. Hi, I'm Special Agent Steph Johnson.
What do you do for a living, Ms. Johnson?
I'm a senior special agent with the FBI. I've been working there for almost 20 years now.
How'd you get to working with the FBI, ma'am?
Well, ever since I was a little girl, I always knew that I wanted to work in law enforcement. You see, my father, he was in the Navy, and it's somewhat of a family tradition to serve our country.
All right, ma'am, I want to talk about some basic facts of today's case. Who is the defendant?
The defendant is a woman named Kara Bassett. She owns an elephant animal sanctuary in Florida.
And how are you involved in today's case?
I became involved when the defendant herself called me in a missing persons case for her husband, Don Clark. She told me that he had been missing for over a week, and I became the lead investigator on the search for his person.
And in the course of your investigation, did you make any arrests related to that missing persons case?
Yes, sir. I arrested the defendant.
Before we talk about the evidence that led you to that arrest, I want to walk the jury through some information about the defendant. So, ma'am, what was the relationship between the defendant and the man who disappeared, Don Clark?
Well, the defendant and Don Clark were married. They both worked at and ran the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
And, ma'am, in the course of your investigation, did you uncover any evidence of any disagreements the two of them had about running that elephant park?
I did, sir. Throughout the course of my investigation, I found that Don Clark, the victim, wanted to run the park as a zoo. But the defendant, his wife, she wanted to run it as a sanctuary.
As far as you could tell from the way the park was set up, which one of them had final say?
Well, the park was a zoo. That would be her husband.
Mr. Dempsey, could we get the power of attorney agreement? Detective, I'm showing you a power of attorney agreement signed by both parties. According to this agreement, Are there any circumstances under which the defendant could have taken full control of that animal sanctuary?
Yes, sir, there is. There's a clause in this document that states, in the event of Mr. Clark's disappearance, that the defendant would gain full control over his assets, the park included.
Hang on, ma'am. You said the clause says in the event of his disappearance. Do you know who put that clause in there?
Yes, we actually do. From a letter that the Clark attorney wrote, I learned that the defendant herself asked and pushed for that clause specifically to be in there. The disappearance clause, I believe, is what it's called.
All right, ma'am, I want to move on and talk about what happened on August 25th, 2017. How did you first become involved in this case?
Like I mentioned earlier, the defendant's the one who brought my attention to the missing persons case. She called and told me that her husband had been missing for a week. She didn't know where he was. That day is when I began my investigation.
And detective, in the course of your investigation, did you find any evidence that you couldn't explain with the story the defendant had told you?
Yes, sir. Initially, the defendant had told me that she was worried sick about her husband, she was scared and wondered where he was, but I found 3 key discrepancies that didn't match what she told me initially.
What were those discrepancies?
Well, the first was whether or not she had been at the swamp where we tracked the park's van. The second was in regards to a missing tranquilizer. And the third was what the defendant did after her husband disappeared.
All right, detective, you mentioned 3 things there, so I want to walk the jury through those one at a time. Let's start with the first. You said that there was a discrepancy in whether the defendant had gone to a swamp. What role does a swamp play in today's case?
We found evidence that a van that belonged to the victim, Dawn Clark, drove from the elephant park to a swamp hundreds of miles away during the middle of the night, the day he went missing.
Now, detective, did you ever ask the defendant about that swamp?
Of course. She told me that she'd never even heard of the Big Gum Swamp, that she'd never been there before.
So, ma'am, what, if any, evidence did you find that didn't make sense given what the defendant told you?
We found a rare form of algae. It's my first time dealing with something so specific and rare, but this microscopic algae, it was found at the swamp and later found inside the van itself and on the defendant's own shoes that were back at the park.
Mr. Dempsey, could we get the forensic report? So, ma'am, according to this forensic report done by the FBI, where does the mud from the defendant's boots match?
It matches almost directly with the algae from Big Gum Swamp.
And how likely does this report say it is?
Objection,
that the mud
Your Honor, to an improper opinion. May I be heard?
Yes, Mr. Besman, please.
Your Honor, the witness isn't a forensic expert. Now, we agree that this report comes from a forensic expert, but the wording she used, it matched almost directly, is nowhere contained within this forensic report. The only way she could have come up with it is if she was testifying as a forensic expert, which she's barred from doing under Rule 702.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please.
No, she didn't give any opinion of her own. If Mr. Besman believes that that line isn't in the report, he's welcome to cross-examine on it. But the question I asked was referring to this report, what does this person conclude is the likelihood of that mud coming from that swamp? There's no opinion coming from the detective herself, just from the document.
Besman?
Yes, Your Honor. The question, if I remember correctly, was actually whether or not that mud matched. And the witness's answer was it matched almost directly. Now that we have the exhibit and evidence, you can see it's contained nowhere within the exhibit. So the only way for her to have said that is if she was making the conclusion. The remedy for that isn't impeachment. The remedy is objection because it's an improper opinion.
Your Honor, may I respond? Yes,
Motion
Your
to
last time.
strike, Your Honor.
Okay, it's stricken.
Detective, referring just to what was written in this document, what does the forensic examiner say about the likelihood that this mud comes from this swamp?
The analyst says it was highly likely.
All right, ma'am, I want to talk about that second discrepancy you mentioned. You said it had to do with a missing tranquilizer. Exactly what kind of tranquilizer are we talking about here?
Elephant tranquilizers. They were kept at the park on the grounds, usually locked in an equipment storage unit that the defendant and some employees had access to.
And ma'am, do you know if those tranquilizers were monitored by the park?
I do, yes. There was a logbook that was kept for these tranquilizers specifically that noted every person who used one and how many were remaining.
So detective, under this logbook, how many tranquilizers were there supposed to be on the day in question?
On the day in question, there were supposed to be 24 remaining elephant tranquilizers.
And when you searched the scene, how many tranquilizers did you find?
23.
So ma'am, you say there's one tranquilizer unaccounted for. Did you ever ask the defendant about that?
I did, yes.
What'd she tell you?
She said, I have no idea how one syringe got misplaced.
All right, ma'am, let's move on and talk now about that third discrepancy you mentioned in what the defendant told you. You said it had to do with what she did after her husband disappeared. Exactly what did the defendant tell you she did?
She told me that she was worried, that she was scared, and she wanted to find her husband. But that's not what I found in the cell records.
What did you find in the cell records?
Objection, Your Honor, to a lack of personal knowledge, if I may be heard.
Please.
The witness testified that Miss Bassett told her she was scared and she wanted to find her husband, but that's not what I found in the cell records. Of course, the witness can testify to the cell records. We've stipulated their admissibility. But to say that the cell records show that the witness wasn't scared, she wasn't looking for her husband, or that Miss Bassett wasn't scared or looking for her husband, requires the witness to delve into Miss Bassett's mindset, and it's inadmissible.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Let me just make sure I get the grounds down, Mr. Besman. What's the grounds for your objection?
Your Honor, it's speculation.
Okay,
Your Honor, may I
Mr.
respond?
Becker. Yes.
I don't believe that the detective was trying to testify to what Miss Bassett was actually feeling. She's just testifying to her investigation, the evidence she found. And it's not an improper opinion under 701 because that testimony is based on her rational perception. May I make an offer of proof?
Well, that wasn't the grounds for Mr. Besman's objection. He says that she's speculating when she says that. How do you respond to that?
Your Honor, we believe that this isn't speculation because it falls within her rationally based perception. And if I may make an offer of proof about the contents of those phone records.
No, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Motion to strike, Your Honor.
It's stricken.
Detective, what exactly did you find in those phone records?
Well, I found that the defendant didn't make any calls or any texts to any member of law enforcement for a full week until her husband was missing. Then she called me.
Ma'am, you said that she didn't make any calls to law enforcement for that full week. During that full week, how many times did the defendant text her husband?
None.
During that full 7 days, how many times did the defendant try to call the husband who she claimed was missing?
These cell records show me she didn't.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Mr. Besman, you may cross.
Yes, Your Honor.
Just a moment, Your Honor, for the tech.
Take as long as you need.
My apologies, Your Honor. Detective, Thank you, Your Honor. Detective, I'd like to pick up right where you left off, okay?
Sure. Yes, sir.
You were telling us that you had a GPS tracker on that van, right?
We found GPS records, yes.
I can't hear anybody else.
Okay, Mr. Besman, looks like you've frozen.
That's what it appears for me.
I'm so sorry, Your Honor. Can you?
We've lost your video too now. Okay, you're back video, but okay, you look like you're good now. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry about that, Your Honor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about the GPS tracking of that van. Mr. Owens, can we get Exhibit 31, please? So, ma'am, just to be clear, nothing in this GPS tracker links Kara Bassett to the swamp. Isn't that right?
In the tracker specifically, no.
Right, the tracker just tells you about the van.
Right, the location of the van, that it began at the park, went to Big Gum Swamp, and then went to the airport at around 4 in the morning.
So that's a pretty long trip, right?
It is around 4 hours round trip in the middle of the night.
139 miles one way, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And 132 miles back.
Exactly.
You were trying to find some eyewitnesses who could tell you they saw Kara Bassett driving that long track either on the way there or on the way back. Isn't that right?
Yes, just trying to find any eyewitnesses who saw that van that night.
You couldn't find a single one.
That's correct.
No gas station attendants.
I didn't find a single one.
No receipts from a gas station registered to Miss Bassett's credit card?
No, sir.
So the only forensic connection we have to the swamp is the algae. Isn't that right?
That's right. The algae that was found at the swamp and also found on Miss Bassett's boots.
Now, you told us that your forensic expert concluded that it was highly likely that the algae came from the swamp. Isn't that right?
That's what's written in our forensic report, yes.
Well, actually, there's a part of that conclusion that you left out on direct examination, didn't you?
I don't know what you're referring to.
Your forensic examiner was careful to say, I cannot be certain. Isn't that right?
I believe that's correct. She said she can't be 100% certain, but she noted that in her opinion, it was highly likely.
Well, she didn't say 100%. She said, I can't be certain.
That's right.
And that's because she didn't test the park to see if the algae could have come from there.
That's right.
She didn't test any of the mud that might have been in the elephant sanctuary?
Yes, sir. I believe there were no other natural substances tested other than the Big Gum Swamp park water.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about some other people who might be involved in this case. You were telling us about the phone records. Mr. Owens, can I get Exhibit 21, please? So at around 6 p.m., you could see that the victim, Don Clark, received some text messages in Spanish, right?
That's correct. 2 messages, both at 6 p.m.
They say, llámame inmediatamente, right?
That's true.
That translates to call me immediately.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Owens, can I get the phone logs? You can see that just after that, the victim called that same number, right?
That's right. At 6 p.m. that same day.
Had a 52-minute conversation.
Yes.
And just a few hours later, that's when you believe Don Clark disappeared.
That's right.
So, ma'am, it begs the question, who was he talking to?
An unlisted number in Costa Rica.
Well, hang on, you have the phone number right there, right? You see it.
Yes, sir.
You coordinated with the Costa Rican police in this case.
That's right. We spoke to the Costa Rican police about his home in Hermosa Beach, talking to other eyewitnesses that were familiar with him, and none of them had seen or heard from him in recent memory.
So you can't tell the members of the jury who it was that was talking to the victim moments before he disappeared.
That's right. I don't know who owned this phone number. Says
You can't tell us if that person had a motive.
Can't tell you who the person was.
You can't tell us if that person had an alibi.
Objection, Your Honor.
Don't
Cumulative under Rule 403.
Okay, your cumulative grounds, is that what I heard?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Besman.
Your Honor, that was my final question. It's certainly not substantially more cumulative than probative to say that there's an alternate suspect who the lead investigator can't find an alibi for, And that was my last question in the pocket. I was about to move on to something else.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
There's no probative value to bringing in these additional questions about what she does or doesn't know about this person. She already admitted that she doesn't know who called Mr. Clark that evening. It doesn't make any fact more or less likely to say you don't know if that person had an alibi. You don't know where that person was.
I don't think it's prejudicial. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
So one more time, ma'am, you have no idea if that person has an alibi.
Once again, I don't know who that person is.
And that's not the only person in this case who you couldn't establish an alibi or a lack thereof for, is it?
That's right. A few of the employees at the park and also Mr. Clark's ex-wife.
That's right. Some of those employees at the park, you asked them for an alibi and they couldn't give you one.
That's correct.
And then, like you said, you know that the victim had an ex-wife.
I do. Her name was Lisa Clark. They'd been divorced for years.
Even though they had been divorced for years, you know that Lisa Clark was still suing her husband when he went missing.
That's true.
You know that Lisa Clark and her husband, or her ex-husband, didn't have a good relationship.
I didn't know them personally, but from what I could see in phone records, that's correct.
Objection, Your Honor. I'd object to lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Sure.
Mr. Besman hasn't laid any foundation for how the detective would know this. We have a good faith belief that the foundation for this lies in hearsay from a statement from Lisa Clark.
Mr. Besman.
Yes, Your Honor. Am I muted?
No,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Yes, Your Honor. If I'm allowed to one question of leeway under Rule 104B, I'm about to lay that foundation through a statement, and if I may proffer, I believe it will not be hearsay. It'll be an exception to hearsay under Rule 8033. And the time to have that objection is when that statement is elicited.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Sure.
I believe that one of the statements from Lisa Clark, or one of the facts that he elicited without foundation, was that Lisa Clark was currently suing her ex-husband for alimony. Now, 8033 is for statements of someone's mental state. The fact that she is suing her ex-husband doesn't go to that mental state. It's inadmissible hearsay, Your Honor.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Just stop for a second because we're getting ahead of ourselves. The original objection was foundation.
Yes, Your Honor.
And Mr. Besman, your response to it was about 104B. How does that help you?
Yes, Your Honor. Under 104B, I'm asking for one question of leeway to conditionally allow the statement so that I can lay the foundation with the very next question.
And where is that in 104B?
Your Honor, I believe Rule 104B is conditional admittance. Or it states that when the admissibility of a fact is based on evidence that is proffered, the court may admit the fact conditionally so long as the proffered evidence is then produced.
Your Honor,
Mr.
may I
Becker.
respond to that?
Yes, please.
Now, Rule 104B makes it very clear that it's up to Your Honor's discretion of whether to conditionally admit this evidence. Now, we believe that this evidence isn't going to actually be supported by any admissible evidence that comes in. And of course, you can't unring a bell, members of the jury. We ask that it be stricken from the record now.
Well, obviously, we wouldn't be dealing with this in front of a jury, but we find ourselves in this situation. So I'm going to overrule the objection, but it's conditional under 104B. If Mr. Besman cannot lay the foundation, then you can reassert your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, ma'am, you actually spoke with Lisa Clark after her ex-husband disappeared, right?
For a matter of minutes. She didn't want to speak to the FBI.
She actually told you that she felt glad that her husband was gone.
That's one of the things she said.
She told you she believed he deserved to die.
Correct.
Ma'am, you wanted to look into Lisa Clark more, didn't you?
I did at the time, but I found enough evidence in the defendant.
Well, let me get that straight. You started looking at the defendant, so you ignored Lisa Clark?
No, sir, that's not correct.
Well, let's make this clear. Lisa Clark refused to cooperate with your investigation.
She didn't want to speak to me.
You were never able to establish an alibi for Lisa Clark.
That's correct.
Objection, Your Honor. At this time, I re-raise my objection to lack of foundation, specifically to the fact that Ms. Clark was suing her husband for alimony. That has not been established by any statements.
Okay, Mr. Besman, how did you establish that?
Your Honor, I must have misunderstood the objection. I thought the objection was to whether or not the relationship was troubled, and I laid the foundation that Ms. Clark believed that her ex-husband deserved to be dead. The statement about the lawsuit for alimony had come out several questions before Mr. Becker's objection. If that was the objection, it was just untimely.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please.
My original objection was to both of the statements from Lisa Clark, the fact that she was suing for alimony and the fact that they had a troubled relationship. Now, I understand that they established certain facts about that relationship through admissible hearsay statements, but we haven't heard anything about any kind of lawsuit from Lisa Clark.
What about that, Mr. Besman?
Your Honor, if you would like foundation for that, we can lay that foundation as well. That would just
Let's
take
do
one or
that.
two questions.
Yeah, I mean, I can't listen back to the transcript at this point, so let's just do that. Sustained.
Yes, Your
Of
Honor.
course, Your Honor.
Motion to strike until that foundation is laid.
Yes.
Ma'am, you received a letter from Mr. Clark's personal attorney, right?
That's right. It's a letter I mentioned earlier on direct examination, the letter about the disappearance clause.
And in that letter, he told you that Mr. Clark's ex-wife was suing him for alimony. Isn't that right?
He didn't tell me that, no.
Are you saying he didn't say in the letter that he was suing his ex-wife or his ex-husband, excuse me?
I think there's a bit of confusion. You asked if he told me that. He never told me that. It was to his attorney.
But it was provided in the letter that attorney gave to you. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
All right, ma'am, I want to take a step back here. Now, you showed us a picture of a syringe on direct examination. Mr. Owens, can we get that up, please? That picture of the syringe, ma'am, that wasn't the murder weapon, right?
No, it wasn't.
Right, that syringe is still full of the elephant tranquilizer that you believe killed Mr. Clark.
That's right. This is one of those elephant tranquilizers, one of the hundreds that they had at the park.
You actually couldn't find the thing that you believe to be the murder weapon, right?
That's right. That one syringe that was unaccounted for. It's never been found.
You can't tell us whose fingerprints might be on that syringe.
No, we don't know where it is. The only thing we know about those syringes is that the last person to log one out was the defendant.
And you can't tell us that elephant tranquilizer was found in Mr. Clark's body, can you?
No.
You can't tell us that because you don't know where his body is.
That's right.
So, ma'am, at the end of the day, you brought a murder charge without a murder weapon and without a murder victim's body. Did I get that right?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
How is that argumentative?
Well, Your Honor, it's not establishing any new facts on the record. Mr. Besman has already asked Detective Johnson about all of the relevant facts contained in that. He's just summarizing it like a closing argument for the members of the jury. It's not admissible.
Mr. Besman?
Yes, Your Honor, this is cross-examination of the government's designated agent. If the government designated the agent, she can talk about the fact that a murder charge was brought despite the lack of evidence that was provided. It's not argumentative, it's just cross-examination.
I agree. I don't see any argumentation there. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, ma'am, you would agree with me. The government brought a murder charge without presenting a murder weapon or a murder victim's body.
We don't have the body, that's true, and we don't have the missing syringe. But given the evidence, that missing syringe coupled with the GPS testimony, forensic data, we can assess that this was a homicide.
Thank you, ma'am. No further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Becker, redirect.
Yes, Your Honor. Detective, you were asked some questions about someone named Lisa Clark. Do you have any reason to believe that Lisa Clark had access to Mr. Clark's van?
No, sir, not at all.
Do you have any reason to believe that anyone with an unlisted Costa Rican phone number has access to Mr. Clark's van?
No, sir, once again, not at all. That van belonged to the park. And the only people who lived at the park were the victim, Don Clark, and the defendant.
How about that tranquilizer? You have any reason to believe that Lisa Clark had access to the tranquilizer case?
No, sir. Once again, those tranquilizers were kept under lock and key and meticulous observation in a logbook at the park.
Any reason to believe that any Costa Rican people had access to that tranquilizer?
Not at all.
Did the defendant have access to that tranquilizer in that van, ma'am?
She did. To both.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Any recross, Mr. Besman?
No recross, Your Honor.
Thank you, Detective, for your testimony. You are excused. Anything further from the government?
Nothing further, Your Honor. We rest our case.
The defense may call its first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Ms. Jo Kwong to the stand.
Joe Kwong, consider yourself sworn. You may be seated. Mr. Besman.
Ma'am, would you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hey y'all, I am Joanne Kwong, but most people call me Jo.
What do you do for a living, Joe?
Well, I'm a filmmaker. When I was a little kid, I used to take my parents' Canon and like film my little sister's diapers being changed. They didn't really like that, but they eventually got me my own camera, and I've been making documentaries ever since.
Have you ever worked with somebody named Don Clark when you're making your documentaries?
Yeah, I was actually filming a documentary about Don Clark's wife and her elephants, Kara Bassett, in 2017.
How much time would you say you spent with them?
Cool. We filmed together pretty much every day for about 2 years.
And how would you describe that relationship as you usually saw it?
The relationship with Kara and Don?
That's right, ma'am.
Oh, they were like lovebirds. I mean, we used to call them like the zoo mom and dad, because they would always be like poking fun at each other and just like taking care of everybody. I don't know, it was just really clear that they really cared about each other, loved each other.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation under Rule 701.
As to
The statement that it seemed really clear that they cared and loved about each other. We don't believe that falls within this witness's rationally based perception. She can say that from what she saw, they seemed to love each other, but we believe that there are parts of their relationship that she just didn't see.
If I may, Your
Mr.
Honor.
Besman. Yes, please.
Your Honor, that goes to weight, not admissibility. The witness testified that she spent tons of time with the couple during the entire year of 2017. It's within a rationally based perception to characterize that relationship. And if Mr. Becker wants to cross-examine on it, that's the proper remedy.
Yeah, agreed. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, ma'am, you told us about the relationship that Miss Bassett had with her husband. But do you know if Miss Bassett was Don Clark's first wife?
No. Don actually had a wife before Kara. Her name was Lisa.
Did you ever meet Lisa Clark?
Yeah, so sometimes I would be at the zoo filming for the documentary, and Lisa came by several times. I remember she was kind of intense. She used to scream at Don like a lot. It was kind of scary.
Do you remember how Don reacted to being screamed at?
Yeah, I remember one time when she came in the summer of 2017, I think it was June, he actually called the cops on her because he kept telling her to leave and she just wouldn't go.
And how did Lisa Clark respond?
So the cops came and they were starting to take her away, and she screamed out at Don. She said, "I'll wipe you off the face of the earth."
Now, ma'am, I'd like to fast forward to the day of Don's disappearance. Were you with him that day?
Yeah, so I saw Don on August 18th. That was the last time I ever saw him.
How was Don acting on the day he disappeared?
Things were pretty normal for most of the day, but I remember at some point we were talking and he got a text on his phone, and he looked down at the text and his face went completely pale. I mean, he was like white. He looked really scared. So then he told me that he had to go take this call.
Do you remember around what time that was on August 18th?
It was around 6 p.m.
Ma'am, I'd like to show you something. Mr. Owens, can we get Exhibit 21 back up? Ma'am, do you see any text messages here that came in around the time that you saw Don Clark go pale?
Yeah, there's one here, or there's two actually, at 6 p.m. It's from an unlisted number. It says Costa Rica. I think the numbers, or excuse me, the text is in Spanish. I'm sorry, I took French. I can't read it.
That's fine, ma'am. Mr. Owens, can I get the call log? Any calls? Were there any calls that came in around that time that you saw Mr. Clark react with fear?
Yeah, here, the fourth one at 6 p.m., it says that there was an outgoing call that 52 minutes, and it looks like it was from that same unlisted number.
Do you have any idea who that unlisted number belongs to?
I don't know.
And after Mr. Clark left to take that call, did you ever see him again?
No, that was the last time I saw Don.
I want to talk a little bit about the police investigation into this case. Did you get to see any of the way that the police were handling evidence?
Yeah, so actually I was filming the documentary like at the ranch when the police were investigating. I got all this footage, and I remember some of the police officers were kind of like picking up all this evidence, but like with their bare hands, like they weren't using gloves. And I remember I thought it was kind of weird, and I remember one of the FBI agents was like yelling at the cops and saying, "No, don't touch the evidence like that."
So let's take that one step at a time. Do you remember what it was that these officers were touching with their bare hands?
Yeah, so at the zoo, they have these tranquilizers, these elephant tranquilizers, and they use them to put the elephants down. I remember, yeah, just like that. And I remember one of the cops picked up that tranquilizer, or not that specific one, but like a tranquilizer that looked like that with his bare hands.
Do you know if they were touching anything else or if it was just the tranquilizers?
They were touching all kinds of evidence, but I specifically remember the tranquilizer.
And you said an FBI agent came in and reprimanded them. Do you know that FBI agent's name?
Yeah, her name was, I think they kept calling her Detective Johnson. She was really nice.
Now, ma'am, you told us that you had spent hours over the course of the year with Don and Kara. How much footage would you say that you have of the couple?
Whew, I would say we got about 2,000 hours, more or less. I mean, enough to make a full documentary with multiple episodes.
And how much of that 2,000 hours did the government subpoena for this case?
The police never asked me for any of the footage.
Thanks for your time today, Ms. Kwong. No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination, Mr. Becker.
Yes, Your Honor. Hi there, Ms. Kwong.
Hi, Mr. Becker.
I want to begin by asking you about some of the things that happened in the relationship between the defendant and her husband in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Okay?
Okay.
Now, ma'am, you told us a little bit about their relationship on direct examination, right?
Yeah, they were really sweet to each other. The moment
Right. You called them lovebirds, actually, right?
they were soulmates.
They were soulmates, ma'am. Let's be clear. The defendant and her husband, they had some disagreements, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, they fought like everybody fights. Sure.
The defendant wanted to run the sanctuary like a sanctuary, right?
Your Honor, speculation.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes, please.
I believe that this is within the scope of a rationally based perception. Certainly, if it's admissible for her to say the defendant loved her husband, it's admissible for her to say that the defendant wanted to run it like a sanctuary. This is based off of a number of interactions over a number of years.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Go ahead.
It's one thing for the witness to say she observed a couple and they seem to have a loving relationship. It's another thing for this witness to delve into somebody's mindset and talk about her hopes and dreams for her business. Without more foundation, which we believe would be hearsay, that's speculation.
Sustained.
Yes, Your Honor. Ma'am, you actually talked to the defendant about her views on that business, right?
Yeah, we talked about it a lot. I even filmed her.
You heard the defendant talking about how she wanted that business to act, right?
Yeah.
And you heard her husband talking about how he wanted that business to act, right?
Yeah, sometimes.
He said that he wanted that business to run more like a business, like a zoo, right?
Objection to hearsay, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Becker? Yes.
This falls under an exception to hearsay, Rule 8033. It was used earlier by Mr. Besman. It allows statements of his then existing mental condition. The fact that he wanted this to be more like a zoo than a business, it goes to his mental state.
May I
Mr.
respond to
Besman?
that?
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor. 8033 does allow for then existing mental states, specifically because there's an extra indicia of reliability when a witness is saying, I was scared of something, I was feeling anxious about something. But 8033 does not allow for specific desires. There's nothing in 8033 that says that out-of-court statements talking about what somebody wants for the future of a business has any extra indicia of reliability. That's standard hearsay. It doesn't fall under the exception.
May I respond?
Go ahead.
Your Honor, 8033 doesn't prohibit anything like that. It says it's for statements of a then existing mental condition. Your Honor, a statement that he wanted something to happen to his business, that he saw it a certain way, is a statement of a then.
The objection is overruled. This is a firmly rooted exception, so indicia of reliability are assumed, Mr. Besman.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Kwong, you heard Mr. Clark say that he saw that business as more like a zoo, right?
Yeah.
And you said a second ago that you actually filmed some of the disagreements between the defendant and her husband, right?
Some of them, not all of them.
No, ma'am, you told us on direct examination that the government never subpoenaed any of your videos, right?
Yeah, they didn't ask me for anything.
Ma'am, you know that we do have some of those videos and evidence, right?
Well, I mean, I brought them, but the government never asked me to bring them.
Well, ma'am, you would recognize a clip from one of your interviews if I were to show it to you today, right?
Yeah, I brought them.
Mr. Dembski, could we get Exhibit 36? Or actually, before we do that, ma'am, Your Honor, at this time we offer Exhibit 36 into evidence, and we'd like to note for the court that it's been previously authenticated.
Mr. Besman?
That's true, Your Honor. No objections.
36 is received.
All right, Mr. Dembski, could we see the clip?
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Ma'am, these disagreements that the defendant and her husband have, they started to escalate, right?
What do you mean?
Well, ma'am, what I mean is that in July of 2017, you actually saw the defendant throw a vase at her husband's head, right?
Oh, yeah. They did have one really big argument, and she threw a vase.
The defendant threw a vase at her husband's head less than a month before he disappeared, right?
Yeah.
All right, Ms. Kwong, I want to talk about someone named Lisa Clark, because you did mention her on direct examination, right?
Mm-hmm. I knew Lisa.
Now, you were shown some phone records. Mr. Dembski, could we get Exhibit 21 again? No, ma'am, you saw that there was a text message sent to Mr. Clark around 6 p.m., right?
Yes, that's the unlisted number, right?
Right. It's an unlisted number from Costa Rica, right?
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Dembski, could we get the phone part of those records? Ma'am, you can see from these records that Mr. Clark had Lisa Clark's phone number in his phone, right?
Yeah.
You can see that Lisa Clark's phone number was not an unlisted Costa Rican number.
Yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, Lisa has a different number than the unlisted number.
And you can see that the number he called on the evening he disappeared was not the number that belongs to Lisa Clark in his phone, was it?
No, that was the unlisted number.
All right, ma'am. I want to talk a little bit more about what you can and can't say about this case. Because, Ms. Kwong, you understand that on the night that Mr. Clark disappeared, someone drove his car 100 miles to a swamp, right?
Yeah.
You understand that around the time he disappeared, a vial of elephant tranquilizer went missing, right?
That's what they told me, yeah.
Ma'am, you have absolutely no reason to believe that Lisa Clark had access to that van, do you?
I have no idea what Lisa Clark had access to. Sorry.
Well, ma'am, you have no reason specific to believe it, do you?
I mean, she would come over to the zoo a lot, and scream at Don. I don't know if she had a key to his car. They never told me.
Well, ma'am, let me ask you an easier question. You know for a fact that Lisa Clark didn't have access to the elephant tranquilizer, right?
Not that I know of. I think the keys were only for the employees.
That's exactly right, ma'am. What you do know is that the defendant did have access to that van, right?
Cara had access to the van. Yes, she worked there.
And what you do know is that the defendant had access to that tranquilizer.
Yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Mr. Besman, any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. May the witness be excused?
Yes, thank you for your testimony. You may step down, and you're excused. Okay, so I'm actually going to just take a minute so that the scorers can catch up. I'm sorry, I haven't done that previously. And I would remind everyone to please switch back to speaker view. And once everyone has completed the witness portion of their ballots, we will move forward. Okay, are the parties ready to proceed to closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Becker, whenever you're okay, Mr. Becker, whenever you're ready.
Your Honor, Mr. Besman, members of the jury, may it please the court. The defendant left pieces behind. Let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, there's no such thing as a perfect crime. No matter how small the piece, how traced the evidence, the criminal always leaves something behind. Now, this defendant sure did a pretty good job of trying to hide her tracks. Used a weapon that she already had, dumped her husband's body in a swamp, abandoned the car. And you know, she probably thought she'd gotten away with it too. Because if you think about it, the pieces she left behind are things that the defendant probably didn't even realize were there. Things like the mud on her boots that matches the rare algae found at the swamp where her husband's car was driven that night. Things like the missing syringe was unaccounted for, that only she and a few other people had access to. Things like the phone records that been members of the jury, you can't run away from evidence like that. You can't run away when you leave it behind like this defendant. Those pieces are why we've brought this charge of murder in the first degree against Cara Bassett. And like I said at the beginning of today's trial, it's pretty simple to prove murder. We just have to show you that she knew what she was doing and that she killed her husband. And it's true that we have to do that beyond a reasonable doubt, but despite all the smoke screens that Mr. Besman's going to try to throw up in closing argument, I want you to understand that that's a very simple concept. Because all it means is that you haven't heard another reasonable story that can be reasonably supported and arrived at looking at the totality of the evidence. And members of the jury, we met that burden today. And we did it by asking you to follow those three pieces that the defendant left behind. So I want to talk about those one at a time, walk you through them one by one. Start with the mud. Now, folks, Mr. Besman made a big deal on the cross-examination of Detective Johnson about how she didn't test the mud at the sanctuary. But folks, you're going to get to read that forensic report when you go back to that deliberation room, and I want you to pay special attention to what it says about the ratio of the algae. Because what the forensic examiner actually found is that the algae found in the mud on the defendant's boots, it's not just a match for what was found at that swamp. It contains a rare mixture, a rare perfect mixture of minerals and algae and elements that perfectly matches the mud found at the swamp. So members of the jury, what are the odds that this swamp 100 miles away from the sanctuary would just happen to contain the exact same kind of algae, down to the ratios of all of the elements next to each other? That's not reasonable, members of the jury. What Mr. Besman is asking you to believe is not a reasonable ask, and it's not reasonable doubt. Let's talk about that second piece the defendant left behind, the syringe. Because this is what I think the defense really just can't get around. Because the sole piece of evidence you heard from them that contested that syringe was what Ms. Kwong said about how the FBI was handling them without gloves. I mean, think about that. How on earth does that explain why the syringe was missing? It doesn't. We heard no explanation for why that syringe would be missing. We didn't rely on any fingerprints on any syringes. That's not relevant to today's case. And we know who had access to that syringe, members of the jury, not Lisa Clark, not some unlisted phone number in Costa Rica, but the defendant. So let's talk about that third piece the defendant left behind, her phone records. Now, this is something that the defense didn't try to touch on at all. And I understand why. Because there is absolutely no explanation for why someone would choose not to call their husband before calling the FBI. I mean, they want you to believe that Miss Bassett was looking for her husband, worried sick about him for a full week, and did not send him one text message. There is no situation in which that is a reasonable thing to ask you to believe, members of the jury. The fact is, when you have so many pieces of evidence that not only fit together, but that all actually point in the exact same direction, when you have a defendant whose story so flatly contradicts what the police found, when you have two people whose relationship escalated to hatred and violence just days before one of them disappears, then members of the jury, that's it. That's what proof beyond a reasonable doubt looks like. I mean, the mud on her boots, the GPS in her car, the phone records waiting a week to call the police, the power of attorney, the motive, the syringe, the lies, members of the jury, evidence does not pile up like this against innocent people. Piles up like this against criminals who left pieces behind. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Mr. Besman.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm going to try my camera setup one more time if the court would bear with me.
Whatever you need to do.
Let's go back. Looks like I'll just have to do it seated, Your Honor. May it please the court. Look a little closer. When you go to buy a car, there's a reason why you always have to ask the dealer to take a test drive first. Because it doesn't matter how great that dealer's sales pitch is, you aren't going to be confident until you look a little closer. When you go to buy a house, there's a reason why you always have to ask the real estate agent to take a tour first. Because it doesn't matter how perfect that house looks from the outside, you won't feel comfortable until you've looked a little closer. When the government accuses a woman of murdering her own husband, there's a reason why the law places the highest burden on their shoulders. Because just like the car, and just like the house, you can't buy what they're selling until you look a little closer. Members of the jury, that burden is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and it is a burden that the government carries alone. Mr. Becker told you that that burden means you haven't heard another reasonable story. That's absolutely false. We have no duty to provide you with any story. The only evidence that the government, or the only thing that the government can do to prove its case, is show you beyond a reasonable doubt that their story is true, regardless of what we offer. But today, I am going to ask you to look closer at three things where you're going to find reasonable doubt again and again. Number one, let's look a little closer at the actual crime. You see, this is a killing. Normally, you would expect that in a killing, the government would tell you how it happened, when it happened, where it happened, but you didn't hear a shred of evidence to paint a picture for you. No eyewitnesses who saw Cara Bassett putting a syringe into her husband. No footage. And as a matter of fact, no syringe and no dead body. You want to talk about missing pieces? We have no idea where the murder weapon and the murder victim even is. Mr. Becker told you don't worry about that. That's not relevant. Their case doesn't rely on it. Fingerprints on the syringe aren't relevant, but members of the jury, you don't know that because you don't have the syringe. I'll tell you one thing, if they had found the syringe and it had fingerprints from Lisa Clark, that would be relevant. If they had found the syringe and it had fingerprints from somebody else, that would be relevant. We don't know because the government hasn't been able to tell you. Number two, let's look a little closer at the forensics in this case. Because the government wants to paint a picture of a perfect match between the algae on Miss Bassett's boots and the algae at a swamp. The only problem is their own expert wasn't as sure. Their own expert said she couldn't be certain about that match. Now, it's true. When you read that forensics report, you'll see that she said it's highly likely that they match. There's two types of algae, so it's highly likely. And maybe if we were playing the lottery, that would make it a worthwhile bet. But we don't gamble when it comes to people's freedom. The burden is beyond a reasonable doubt. Not maybe, not probably. If you don't have a moral certainty, they don't have a case. Number three, let's look a little closer at everybody else who could have committed this crime. Today, you learned that the victim had an ex-wife, Lisa Clark. You learned that they didn't get along at all. Lisa Clark wanted her ex-husband dead. When she found out he was missing, she said, "Good, I'm not going to cooperate with the police. I'm not going to give you any evidence. I'm not going to do what Cara Bassett did. You don't get to know where I was when he went missing." And you learned that it wasn't just Lisa Clark. Mr. Becker told you that that number from the Costa Rican registered phone, well, it couldn't belong to Lisa Clark. Members of the jury, that's exactly the problem. It belonged to somebody else. There's somebody else who called the victim moments before he disappeared. Somebody else who sent him a mysterious text message causing him to go pale with fear, and we have no idea who that person is. The government can't tell you where he was when Mr. Clark disappeared. They can't tell you what kind of motive he had. They can't even tell you a name. But Mr. Becker wants you to ignore all of that. Mr. Becker told you that because the story isn't reasonable, let's go with the more likely option. The woman who cooperated with the police. The woman they were able to get any information on. There's one woman I want you to pay close attention to when you're talking about this trial with your fellow jurors. Remember when Mr. Becker asked Ms. Kwong, "You don't have reason to believe that Lisa Clark had access to those syringes. You don't have reason to believe that Lisa Clark had access to that van." And doesn't that just sum up the government's case perfectly? When they don't know something, they assume it doesn't matter. They assume nobody else could be involved. When they look at Miss Bassett, they presume guilt. Well, there are a lot of tools that a prosecutor has to win a conviction, but presuming isn't one of them. The judge is going to instruct you that from the moment Miss Bassett came on trial, there was only one presumption we were allowed to make about her, and that is the presumption of innocence. We don't know where that syringe went or where the body is. Presumption, innocence. We don't know if the algae on her boots could have come from another source. Presumption, innocence. We don't know who any of these other people are who could have been involved with the crime. Presumption, innocence. Innocence, only innocence. When an innocent woman walks into a courtroom, she doesn't just become guilty because the prosecutor says she is. She doesn't become guilty because she has muddy boots. She doesn't become guilty without proof. And when the state brings a razor-thin case that falls apart the second you look closely at it, she never becomes guilty at all. That's because she never was. Find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Besman. I'm aware that under the local rules, the government may have rebuttal if time permits. Is there time permitting, and do you want rebuttal, Mr. Becker?
Yes, Your Honor, I do believe we have time, and I'd like a rebuttal.
You may proceed.
Now, members of the jury, Mr. Besman asked you to look a little closer, but I'm going to go one step further. I want you to look as close as possible at the evidence. Look as close as possible at that syringe log, at those call logs, at any of it. And ask yourself, if any of what the defense is claiming, if any interpretation of events that doesn't mean that Kara Bassett killed her husband is actually reasonable. Because the only arguments that Mr. Besman could throw at you in his closing were so wildly unsupported by the evidence, it's crazy. I mean, he didn't have a burden, and I want to be very clear about that. But when he brings you this alternate suspect, someone like Lisa Clark, you are allowed to ask yourself if there is any reason to support them. So how on earth could Lisa Clark have gotten that tranquilizer? How on earth could she have gotten that van? And how on earth can the defense explain why the defendant did not call her husband once in the entire week he was missing? We know what she did. We know she killed her husband. We know she left pieces behind. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. So the judges should complete their ballots now and click submit. And I'll ask everyone to stay on until everyone has submitted their ballots, and then we're going to do brief comments. So judges, please submit your ballots.